Well, since we're reading this about the wizard, the way of the wizard, and talking about coincidences and clues, I thought I would interject this here. A story, a true story, it happened to me. It was when I lived in Huntington Beach. Actually, my husband and I were not quite settled because he was looking for a job. We wanted to live in California, and we had come from Maryland because it was just getting too cold there, and he thought he couldn't survive another winter in Maryland. And he was having a problem, Bob was, with his memory. He would have times when he would forget who he even was. It was a terrible time. We were staying in a hotel that we rented by the week, and he was looking for work. He got work one day and went to his job. On the very first day, he forgot who he was. So you can imagine he lost that job. They called me and said, "Your husband doesn't know who he is." And so times were pretty bad. And I was thinking God wasn't really aware of my dilemma, because there we were. We just had little money left before we would just run out completely. And he wasn't able to find work. And he was having these problems where he would forget who he was. And then in about an hour or maybe a couple hours later, he would remember who he was. But this would happen again and again. And every day when he wasn't looking for work, we did a lot of walking. And we walked the streets just for something to do, because a hotel room can be very boring. And we were always finding pennies. And we'd always pick them up. But, you know, when we found a penny, Bob would say one thing and I would say another. But we both were cursing the little pennies that we found, because Bob would say, "Oh, people don't even bother to pick up a penny anymore." And then I would chime in with, "Well, it's just a penny." And so one day I had the idea that we were cursing the pennies, and that wasn't a very good idea, that perhaps we should bless the pennies that we find. We needed some blessings. We needed something to happen good in our favor. And so I just casually thought, well, if Bob can find a penny, I bet he can find a dime or a quarter. That wasn't a real big jump up from a penny. But it wasn't the amount of money that was important. But as it turned out, I just thought that thought to myself. I didn't mention it to Bob. And we had picked up a penny on the street, and then suddenly Bob said, "Let's go to the beach." Because we lived in Huntington Beach, we could walk the beach or we could walk the city streets. So we went to the beach, and Bob just takes out over the sand, running with all his might. And suddenly he stops. And he picks something up, and he says, "Come here, I want to show you something." And I walk over there, and he's holding a dime and a quarter. And just 30 minutes before that, just 30 minutes, I had said, well, if Bob can find a penny, he could find a dime or a quarter. And there he had found both a dime and a quarter. And in the sand, which is, you know, coins in the sand are very easily disguised, because they'll get down under the sand. It's not easy to find coins in the sand. But he said they were both just laying right on top of the sand, like they just had been dropped there. And I was thinking, oh, wow, Bob, you just don't know what I just 30 minutes ago said to myself. That you might find a dime and a quarter as easily as you find a penny. So then, I know you might look at this and say, well, it was just a dime and a quarter, 35 cents, big deal. The big deal was I knew then that my thoughts were heard and my wishes were known, and that I wasn't all alone, and I wasn't scared after that. Things turned out for the good after that. He didn't find a job because he did have this problem, and now I had to be the one to take the lead. And so he got early retirement from his work and collected early retirement, and so we managed to get a little mobile home in a city that wasn't a beach city. But things picked up after that. You know, everything just arranged itself so nicely that we could live comfortably in this city called San Jacinto, California, real close to Hemet, California. And that's where I lived in a mobile home park, and right across the street from the mobile home park, I lived a family that had lived there for many years, and I have one of his books. His name was Kelvin Rowe, although I didn't get to really meet him because he was dying of cancer when I found out that he was my neighbor. And I could have talked to him for 2 or 3 years had I known that he even lived there, but you know how we don't get to know our neighbors. And Kelvin Rowe is the one who wrote the book A Call at Dawn, which I read on my channel here. And he had been up with our space brothers from Jupiter and Pluto. Over 300 times, his daughter told me. Over 300 times he had been up in their craft with them. And a very exciting person to know, and I wish I had known him a little better. I feel like I do, though, through his book, which I have typed up. In case anyone's interested, I have that book all typed up and in a file. I could send it to anyone interested. But one more thing I want to mention about Bob when he was having one of these times when he didn't know who he was. It happened suddenly. We were just driving down Freeway 91 on the way back from him looking for work. And suddenly he had this weird feeling and didn't know who he was and asked, "What are we doing?" I said, "Pull over." And we got off of an off-ramp and stopped the car, and I said, "Where do you think you are?" And Bob said, "Well, we're in a spaceship." I said, "We are?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What are we doing?" He said, We're going to Earth." I said, "What are we going to do?" He said, "We're going to Earth, and you're with me, and we're going to tie up some loose ends." That's all he said, and then he didn't say any more about it. He started coming to himself, and I thought, wow. For a moment there, he touched on another reality in which we both were in a spaceship coming to Earth to tie up some loose ends. Oh, yes, and he said, I asked where had we been. He said, "Oh, out visiting different planets." And so I thought, wow, what if that were part of my future? That would be wonderful. I would love that. And you know, since reading all the kind of literature that I do, I think this is entirely possible that, you know, that could happen. That was everything that happens at the same time, simultaneous, and he might have just seen another life that I don't have a remembrance of, but maybe someday I will, and maybe get to relive that experience. And so it was a very revealing time, and it started my quest to become more familiar with metaphysical insights, and I started reading all kinds of books and typing them up and talking about it with just myself because it seemed no one else was interested, not a bit. My family thought I was crazy. Bob was sort of interested, but he was always afraid of one thing, which he was afraid for his mind to be invaded by the thoughts of anyone else, and that scared him. So he wouldn't often share his thoughts with me about things because his fears were so strong in him that he didn't want to share his thoughts with any other person. But I think we better get used to that, because I don't think anything we do is not known by someone somewhere. And some of those someones somewhere are there to help us and to help give us clues and to show us, yes, we're here and we can help you, but you've got to open up to us and realize that we are here to help you. And that was only one strange thing. Many other strange things happened to Bob and I during his life. I sure do miss him. Anyway, that's all I wanted to interject here.